We're going to be looking at Ecclesiastes chapter 3, which talks about how God has placed eternity in our hearts. This is actually a very famous passage, not only because of verse 11, but also because this is a famous passage due to the Bird song from 1965, where they took the first 8 verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and made it into a song. Now, we talk a lot about how Scripture has a profound effect throughout every single generation and spanning through many millennia. And little did Solomon know when he was writing this chapter that he was going to be writing a Billboard hit 3,000 years later. Well, why don't we read the first 8 verses since they're very popular in their entirety, and then we'll just go through them verse by verse. Verse 1 says, "There's a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to harvest, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, and a time for war and a time for peace." So if you've ever heard the Bird song, that song is just in your head. Well, let's start with verse 1 and 2. The Koheleth, the teacher, the instructor, who we think is Solomon, says that there is time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. And we know that this is true. The seasons dictate and determine a lot of the things that we do. The seasons determine how we dress. The seasons determine certain activities that we do. The seasons can prevent us from doing the things that we want to do because of weather. And so we see that the seasons essentially dictate how we live. And when you look at the Bible, the Old Testament in particular, you'll see that many of the Jewish festivals and holidays were dictated by the seasons. So, for example, Passover, the Feast of Booths, Pentecost, all of these were based on the seasons. And in an agricultural setting where you're farming and that is really your way of life, the seasons can determine whether or not you will be in a time of famine or feast. He also says there's a time to be born and a time to die. Again, when you think about your own birth, there's a lot of things that you look at and realize I'm not in control of much of my birth and my existence. You think about the time of your birth, where you were born, what country you're born into, what family you're born into, what your hair color is, how tall you are. None of those things are under your control. We're also told that there's a time to die. Now, we may foolishly hasten our death, but we can never prevent our death if it's our time, unless God wills it. David says this in Psalm 139, verse 16, "All the days ordained for me were written in your book." God knows every single day that you will live. And so we have this sense that God has control, and the cyclical pattern that we go through is something that He ordains. But that's not necessarily a positive thing because of a lot of the things He mentions. Now, I think humans try to resist this at all costs. This idea of death freaks us out. For example, Ian Pearson, who's a futurologist, which sounds like kind of a glorified fortune teller, says, realistically, by 2050, we would expect to be able to download our mind into a machine so that when you die, it's not really a major career problem. So the idea is that you can sort of download all of your memories, your personality, all of your thoughts, and eventually you can transfer that into, hopefully, another body once our technology gets to that point. Kind of reminds me of this Netflix series, Altered Carbon. I don't know if you saw that. It's kind of interesting. This came out a couple years ago where basically the rich elite had so much money that they could upload all of their memories and thoughts instantaneously into a protected cloud, and they basically had clones of themselves that anytime that clone died, they could simply take another clone and download that information into a new body, and so essentially they were living forever. Now, David Chalmers, who's a transhumanist professor of philosophy, and who also looks like a former hairband member in the 80s, says, no such technology is currently on the horizon, but imaging technology is an area of rapid progress. It's true that we have no idea how a non-biological system, such as a silicone computational system, could be conscious. But the fact is that we also have no idea how a biological system, such as our own, such as a neural system, could be conscious. The gap is just as wide in both cases. So he's saying it's highly doubtful that we'll ever get to something like this. You know, I was thinking about the idea of prolonging our death or trying to withstand death. And it kind of reminds me of, Thanos from Avengers, which is interestingly the Greek word for death, Thanos. And he says, I'm inevitable. So your death, my death, is not within our control. It's inevitable. Well, he says in verse 3 and 4, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. Can Christians dance? Well, some can and some can't. That's evidenced by the New Year's Eve party if you ever go to that. Well, he says that there's a time to weep. Even though there is a time where we are happy, we're joyful, there are also times when we weep. And I think it's normal for us to express emotion in this way. Some of us are so, stoic in our affect that we take great pride in our ability to hold back our emotions. That we can say, it's been years. I can't even remember how long it's been since I've cried. And yet we see that Jesus, he wept. He felt deep compassion for people. Paul the apostle, as he was writing the churches that he planted, describes praying for them with tears flowing down his face. We're also told that there's a time to mourn. One of the things that many of you will experience soon is the loss of a close family member or a friend. And some of us, luckily, have not experienced that yet, but as you get older, you'll find yourself burying people that you have fond memories of and that you have spent significant time building a relationship with. And so there is a process of mourning that we go through. And, mourning is something that's not only natural living in a fallen, broken world, but it's something that God actually encourages us to do. Jesus mourned when he saw his close friend Lazarus die. We see that there are several chapters that are devoted to describing how Job, who went through tragic loss of his family, mourned. And so mourning is something that we experience as life goes on, as we get older. I think in our day, what we want to do is we want to edit this, right? We want to take out all of the negative things and we want to say there's a time to harvest, a time to build, a time to laugh, a time to dance. We want to sort of expunge all of the negative things out of that because for us, we have this expectation that life is going to go great, that it's going to be comfortable, that it's going to be filled with happiness, that we'll never mourn, we'll never weep, we'll never feel emotional discomfort. And yet, what we see is living in the harsh reality of a broken world causes us to experience a whole wide range of emotions and feelings. Verse 5 says, there's a time to scatter stones and a time to gather, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. Well, I can think of a lot of reasons why you should refrain from embracing, situations that may not be appropriate. But you think about embracing, it's a way of showing affirmation and love and affection. Some of us are not really touchy-feely people. We don't really like being touched. We feel nervous showing affection. Some of us are over the top. Some of us need to chill out. Stop touching people, right? Now, I've had a significant problem with this. I'm not really a toucher. And, my close friends always joke about how I only embrace them during special occasions. And usually it's if and when I baptize them or when they get married. So they get a nice special hug from me. And people are always criticizing me for this. And yet I always tell them, I say, well, if I just handed out the hugs, it wouldn't be special anymore, would it? Right? Verse 6, there's a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away. Some of us living in these houses, we're just pack rats, we're hoarding our stuff. There's a time to purge. Take it easy on your roommates. Verse 7, there's a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak. Solomon, who, again, probably wrote this, spoke extensively in the Proverbs about how our speech can have a great impact. And so having discretion in the way that we speak, speaking wisely is incredibly important. In fact, the Bible devotes so much to this that there's an entire chapter in the book of James devoted to how the way that we speak can destroy people's lives or it can heal people. You see this quality in Jesus where there were times when he spoke clearly and answered people whenever they had a genuine question. But when he discerned that they were trying to entrap him, like the religious leaders, what did he do? He confounded them with his responses. At other times, he didn't speak to fulfill the prophecy about him in Isaiah, where he stood before his accusers and eventually his executors as if he was a sheep that was silent before his shearers. Now, the last thing is there's a time to love and a time to hate and a time for war and a time for peace. So I guess when you look at this, there's not really much commentary about whether this is supposed to be encouraging. Is this wisdom literature that we're supposed to look at and try to learn some lessons from? Well, I think what Solomon is doing here, the Koheleth, is he's using a rhetorical device called a merism. And there are 14 merisms in this 8 verses. And really, it's a device which puts two polar opposites in juxtaposition to sort of encompass everything in between, the totality. So, for example, there's a time to be born and a time to die and everything in between. There's a time to laugh and there's a time to weep and a full range of emotions in between those things. And so what he's essentially saying is that there is a full range of life that we live. Not just the high highs, but also some of the very low lows, as some of us have experienced. Not only that, I think there's some troubling aspects of this as well. You read this and you almost feel like we're being made to dance to a tune not of our own making. Somebody else is sort of dictating the pace. And, it's interesting when sometimes we get absorbed in a certain activity that gives us fulfillment. And yet we wonder, are we really the ones driving this? Or is there a force outside of us that's causing us to do this? How do we know that sometime later we might be doing just the opposite of that? How do we know that, in one moment we are trying to heal people with our words, and the next moment we're injuring them with our words? You think about peace-loving nations that prepare for war, or somebody who takes in an animal and, nurses it back to health and then eventually has to put it down later on in life. We see that there are these contrasting, almost negating influences here. Derek Kidner says this, he's an Old Testament professor. He says, perhaps our choices are no freer than our responses to winter, summer, childhood, and old age. The steady march of time dictates what we do. You see, the thing is, we believe wrongly that we actually have control over our lives. And yet there are so many outside factors that control the way that we live. Secondly, nothing we pursue really has any sort of permanence. We may build something, but later on it's going to be torn down. And so again, it's kind of a dim picture. We need to remember that this book is written from a certain perspective, where the Koheleth, the person who's sort of like a philosophy professor, is trying to take us and help us move toward the logical conclusions of our worldview. And so he's envisioning what life would be like if all there was this life under the sun. In other words, a life where God does not exist, where it's merely cause and effect. And it's a very dim picture. And again, we see that there is this canceling out, birth, death, planting and harvesting, healing and killing, dancing and mourning. And so we have a very dark picture here where it almost seems like all of this toil, all of this work that we're putting into our lives, these things that we're furiously pursuing, it seems like the net sum is zero. He says in verse 9 and 10, by way of reminder, what do workers gain from all of their toil? That sort of reminds you of what he said in chapter 1, verse 13, if you were with us, where he says, what does man gain from all of this toil for which he works under the sun? He says, I've seen the burden God has laid on the human race. And so, again, he's trying to help us see this is what life is like if God doesn't exist, if he's not around. He says in verse 11, he has made everything beautiful in its time. He's also set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. This is maybe one of the most profound verses in the Bible, that God has set or put eternity into the human heart. That there's an imprint there, something deep that we cannot dislodge, no matter how many rational arguments we throw at the idea that God exists. There's something within us that tells us that there's an innate sense that we are different and that there's something more than this life. He says, no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. And, it's kind of like, imagine if you were desperately nearsighted and you walked up to a mural, but you could only be a couple feet away and you had to inch along. Your peripheral vision, your poor vision might tell you something of the quality of this great mural, but it's impossible for you to be able to stand back and see the entire picture. And so in the same way, a lot of times we see something in a very limited fashion, certain elements of our life, but we fail to see the bigger picture of what God is doing. And I think for those who are non-Christian people, people who do not have faith necessarily, that is something that is disconcerting. It's dismaying to feel like I cannot see the big picture. I don't know how all of this work that I'm putting into this thing right now equates to the whole. Not so for the Christian believer. We're told that He has made everything beautiful in its time. I like how the New Living Translation puts it, where they say, God has made everything fit beautifully in its time. Have you ever been in a situation where you've suffered greatly or you've experienced difficulty in your life, and in the moment you felt so confused, you didn't know what was even going on, you felt disoriented, and then years later you can look back and see what God was doing? And it's amazing to you. I wonder at the end of our lives, for those of us who know Christ, that we're going to be able to stand back and see this great work that God has done, encompassing not only the high highs of our lives, but also the low lows. In large part because the things that bring us so much happiness, that we think bring us happiness, a lot of times are not the things that give us profound insight in life. You know, when you go to Disney World, where I'm going in January, happiest place on earth, you know, you don't go there and think, wow, what a life-changing experience, right? Well, some of you may feel that way. But, you know, during times of intense suffering, times where you experience real spiritual darkness in your walk with God, those really stand out as the times where you experience real insight, not only about who God is, but also about who you are. Well, he says he has also set eternity in the human heart, that there are artifacts inside of us that are undeniable, and that if we decide that we're going to deny that God actually exists, then we inevitably live a life that is contradictory. Why don't we look at a few of these areas? Areas where there seems to be eternity in our hearts. What about beauty? Right? Human beings are unique in the sense that we enjoy listening to music. We enjoy looking at beautiful things. We enjoy creating things. And you might say, well, a spider creates a beautiful web. Well, that's utilitarian. That's not form, that's function. It's trying to live. It's trying to capture things to eat, right? But when you're sitting there, you know, reenacting the ghost scene where you're making the pottery on the wheel, maybe with your boyfriend or girlfriend or your spouse, you know, you're creating something and you're like, what's the utility in that? You're not going to use that pot for anything. You're going to put that up on your mantle and look at it, right? And so in the same way, we need to think about, how does beauty factor into this? Julian Barnes, who is an English author, talks about how looking at beautiful things and hearing beautiful music gives him this transcendent feeling, almost as if there's something more. And specifically, he talks in one article about how he remembers listening to Mozart's Requiem for the first time, which has a lot of different themes that are Christian about death, resurrection, and the afterlife and judgment. And yet he realizes, as somebody who does not believe in God, that those things should not move him in the way that he feels moved. And it's not just the music, it's not just the arrangement of notes, the composition, it's also the content that moves him as well. He says this, it is one of the haunting hypotheticals for the non-believing person. What would it be like if the Requiem were true? Leonard Bernstein, who was an American composer and conductor, talked about how when he would listen to Beethoven, that he would feel a sense of heaven. He says this: Beethoven has the real goods, the stuff from heaven. The power to make you feel at the finish something is right in the world. There's something that checks through, that follows its own law consistently, something we can trust that can never let us down. He senses something as he is having an experience listening to beautiful music, that he's touching something transcendent. And yet, what would be the naturalistic perspective of beauty? What the person who holds a naturalistic view would say is, when you look at beauty, our appreciation of beauty is really just an artifact of our ancestors who identified a fertile plain where they could find food as a beautiful landscape. And so therefore, our appreciation of beauty is no more than an artifact of natural selection. And yet something in us tells us that that's not right, that there's something more to it than that, that human beings actually seem to be set apart in this regard compared to all other species on earth. King David, Israel's first king or second king, says, "The heavens proclaim the glory of God. The skies display his craftsmanship." The reason why, according to Scripture, we are actually creative and we appreciate things that are beautiful is because God himself is creative, and that he creates for his pleasure and for our appreciation. When you look at these, stunning creation, strange birds and animals, when you go to beautiful landscapes, what you're identifying there is the workmanship, the craftsmanship of God. And since we have been created in God's image, we create and enjoy beauty. What about morality? Well, when we talk about morality, I think there's an explanation that a lot of people who hold to a naturalistic view would give. Namely, that morality is nothing more than a mechanism of natural selection. That what you see with morality is a slow evolution where entire societies, groups of people were cooperating with one another to survive and eventually reproduce, to thrive. And so all of these different cultures came up with their own set of rules, so to speak, that then harden into morals that we have today. So really, when we talk about morality, we're not talking about some sort of overarching morality that fits over everyone and every culture, but instead we're talking about something that is localized. Because each set of individuals in their specific context develop their own strategies for survival and reproduction. And so therefore, for us to say that my moral norms or my cultural conditioning is something that I should impose on a different culture is a real problem. It makes no sense. If the universe represents a closed system of cause and effect, then what room does it leave for things like right and wrong? How can we really say that something is objectively right and wrong? How can we critique another culture for cannibalism or bullfighting, things that we think are ethically wrong, when in fact that is what their culture does? Who are we to judge them? Alvin Plantinga, the Christian philosopher at Notre Dame, says this: could there really be any such thing as a horrifying wickedness if there were no God and we just evolved? I don't see how. A secular way of looking at the world has no place for genuine moral obligation of any sort, and thus no way to say that there is anything as genuine and appalling wickedness. Accordingly, if you think there really is such a thing as horrifying wickedness and not just some sort of illusion, then you have a powerful argument for God. In other words, when we look at things that we find to be morally wrong, we want it to say more than, this makes me feel uncomfortable, or this, because of my cultural conditioning, I personally believe that doing this is wrong. We want that language to mean more than that. We want it to mean that whenever we look at something like female genital mutilation in another country, that we're saying it's wrong no matter what. It doesn't matter what culture you come from. That's what we want to say. And yet, from the naturalistic perspective, we're unable to say that. We're just saying what we're culturally conditioned to say. And that's a huge problem. By contrast, what we're told is that God is a God of morality. That He is a God who is righteous. And that what He tells us in Scripture, what He declares, is not just the speculation of ancient humans, but that it's revelation from God Himself, which is really an expression of His perfect moral character. And so when we feel moral emotions, when you see, for example, a bunch of teenagers packed in a car splashing students down on OSU's campus after a big rainstorm, and we think, that is messed up. That moral motion that we feel is something that God has actually embedded in our hearts. When we see social injustice, not only in our country, but throughout the world, and we say, that is wrong, that is the eternity in our hearts that God has imprinted. What about death? Yvonne Yalom, who is an Epicurean psychiatrist, says, despite the staunchest, most venerable defenses, we can never completely subdue death anxiety. It's always there, lurking in some hidden ravine of the mind. Only one thing will prevent you from watching every person you know die from murder, accident, or disease, and that will be your own death from murder, accident, or disease. This guy needs to lighten up. He needs to have a drink. Calm down a little bit. But, when you look at this, I think when we look at our own death, it freaks us out. And some of you might say, well, I'm not worried about death. That's probably because you're not thinking about it. You don't want to think about it. Some of us would say, well, with the short time that I have on earth, I want to actually use it for good. I want to make a difference in this world. Imagine you're on a plane and you look out the window and you see this. One of the engines on fire, right? And the captain gets onto the speakerphone and says, this is your captain. The plane is going to explode. So you have a few minutes to live, and you think to yourself, what am I going to do with this short time that I have? You might say, well, I'm going to be kind to all of my fellow passengers in my final moments. But if you're kind to your fellow passengers, the result is going to be this. Let's say you decide, you know what? I'm going to spend the remaining moments of my life living selfishly and maybe treat some of the people on this plane cruelly. And if you do that, the result will be this. And so what's the point, right? If all that there is this life under the sun, then why does it matter? Who cares? And yet something deep inside of us tells us that death is unnatural. You don't go to a funeral and say, that was beautiful. There's something twisted and distorted in watching somebody that you love laying there in a casket, lifeless, a shell of what they used to be. Jesus, like I mentioned earlier, when he saw Lazarus and when he went to his funeral, we're told that he was moved. And the Greek word there could mean that he felt anger, that he was dismayed, that he was morally indignant by what he saw. Because, from God's perspective, seeing death is an abnormality. It's an anomaly. God never intended for that to happen. But we live in a broken world. What about this last area, human responsibility and free will? Leonid Perlovsky, who is a research professor at Northeastern University, says, free will has a fundamental position in many cultures. Morality and judicial systems are based on free will. Denying free will threatens to destroy the entire social fabric of a society. We would agree. If we believe that free will does not exist, then how can we punish those who have committed crimes or who have done wrong? And yet, from a naturalistic point of view, what is free will? You're not free to choose. You're not free to do as you please. We live in a closed system of cause and effect. And so what we think is actually our free will are just neurons firing in our brain based on input that we're getting from our environment. Nothing more. Stimulus response. And we can explain it however we want, but from a naturalistic point of view, that is the brute fact. Well, one author puts it this way. We shouldn't be trying to moralize things that happen. And he says, quote, "It would be impossible to find a fox which has a kindly and protective disposition toward geese, just as no cat exists which has a friendly disposition toward mice. That is why the struggle between the various species does not arise from a feeling of hostility, but rather from hunger. In both cases, nature looks on calmly and is even pleased with what happens. There cannot be a separate law for mankind in a world which planets and suns follow their orbits, where moons and planets trace their destined paths." In other words, when you see humans dominating other humans, killing other humans, what's happening? That's just natural selection playing out. And the person who wrote this was Adolf Hitler. An excerpt from Mein Kampf. Now let me be clear. I'm not saying that if you're somebody who holds to a naturalistic point of view that you should be a Nazi. What I'm saying is, when you think about the naturalistic point of view, things like this are actually compatible with it. And one of the things that the Bible declares, again, in contradiction to this, is that human beings are responsible, that we do have free will. God created humans in His image and gave us an option. He gave us choices. The original humans, when they were set up in this beautiful garden, had a variety of different fruit trees to eat from, and yet God marked out this one tree. He says, "Don't eat from this one, for in the day that you do it, you shall surely die." And so humans had a choice: obey God or rebel against Him. And human beings, according to Scripture, decided to rebel against God, thus causing this cascade of brokenness and fallenness and evil that we see in our present day. And yet God, in His mercy, in His love, decided to give us a way out. The Bible declares that God came in the man Jesus to come and die, not only to forgive us for our guilt, but also to open a way for a relationship with Him. And Revelation 3:20 says that God stands at the door and knocks, and He's waiting for you to respond. And if you open that door, He will come in, and He will be with you. And so we have incredible choice according to the Bible. That feeling that we have, that we're free choosing beings, that our choice has significance and real impact, that's real, and we know it. It's undeniable, and it's from God. Well, he says, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. The NLT says, but even so, it's a little bit stronger than the NIV, even so, people cannot see the whole scope of what God is doing from beginning to end. We can't see the whole picture. And yet, one of the things that believers have realized over time is that even though we can't see the big picture, God is still in control. You know, COVID has basically ripped the control out of all of our hands. I don't know if you felt that way over the last 2 years. It's like a time warp of feeling totally helpless. And yet, one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that even though we are not in control, even though this illusion of control that we think we have on our lives has been taken away from us, or at least has been made evident to us very clearly, God is still in control. And then finally, he says in verse 12 and 13, I know that there's nothing better for people to do than to be happy and to do good while they live, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all of their toil. So he says, you know, we can live our lives, enjoying our lives, doing good things, finding satisfaction in our work. And yet there's still this note of finality while we live. And yet our death does not have the final word. He adds, because this is a gift of God. What a wonderful thing to be able to enjoy pleasure, to enjoy relationships, to enjoy our work. And how can we actually do that when we place all of our identity, all of our lives on the weight of these things that inevitably leave us wanting? You know, from the believer's standpoint, we can actually enjoy pleasure. We can enjoy achievement because we know that that's a gift from God. It's something that He's apportioned to us. And he says, I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it. Nothing can be taken away from it. God does this so that people will fear Him. And so this word forever actually connects with verse 11. It's the same Hebrew word for eternity. And so what God has put in us will never be taken away. It will endure forever. Our life does have meaning. It does have significance, not because of our toil, not because of the things that we do, but because they're a gift from God. There is a life after this life. There's more to this life than what we're doing. And we can have an impact that lasts beyond this life. And finally, he says his aim is so that people will fear him. And this word doesn't just simply mean to be afraid, to cower, but it also means to acknowledge, to have reverence, to see who God is. Okay, let's draw a few conclusions. I think the first thing is, some of you are facing doubts about God's reality. Some of you are facing some intellectual problems, not knowing whether God is real. And again, as I've mentioned before, if you're feeling that way, you need to know it's common. It's normal to feel that way as a Christian. What I like to do is imagine if you erase God from the equation, you erase all marks of eternity in your heart. These things that mean so much to us, that are so significant in the way that we live our lives, if we simply rip God out of the equation, then those things make no sense at all. The thought that we are significant, the thought that our lives matter. The second thing is, God has made everything fit beautifully in its appropriate time. One of the things that we need to learn how to do is to hold on to what is unseen and to trust God, knowing that He's in control. Finally, Some of you sense that God is real and that He may have a plan for your life. As I mentioned, God wants to have a relationship with you. Your life does have meaning. It does have purpose. And God wants you to know that your life will have true fullness once He enters in. And so I'd encourage you, if you have never opened the door to God in your life, to invite Him in, that you have an opportunity to do that tonight. And if you do it, you will not regret making that decision.